Little Romance and I were at my mom's for just a couple of days, and we ended up watching When Harry Met Sally one night.
Has he seen it before?
No, he'd never seen it.
You saw 2 movies then with him. Oh, tell everybody.
Yeah, so we watched that and Sleepless in Seattle.
Wait, I thought you watched Moonstruck too.
That we watched
3
the week
classics.
before. 3 classics. He liked When Harry Met Sally the best and Moonstruck second. Sleepless in Seattle, I think, was...
I watched it twice by myself this season.
It's Johnny Camilleri. So the thing that was amazing, though, is I haven't seen it in its entirety, When Harry Met Sally.
For a while.
For a solid decade, at least.
Wow.
And it was really fun. Afterwards, I sent Little Romance like the funniest TikTok about it. And it's a young Black woman who's basically like, Caucasians. This is your culture.
And it is.
And it is. And the thing that I think is just, is really amazing about it is, of course, when I saw When Harry Met Sally when I was, in high school, I didn't realize that it was my culture.
No.
Right? And so anyway, it was really fun to watch again. Nora Ephron just writes the funniest fucking dialogue, right?
Terrific.
It is so, like, everything about it is just so sharp. And so it was just really fun. And I can't remember which part exactly we were like cracking up at, but like the whole thing is just so, the entire thing from top to bottom is funny. Also, of course, as Chicagoans, there's like a really funny part at the beginning where they're at the University of Chicago, which is in my neighborhood. And then they're like driving to New York and they end up like driving past the city of Chicago and through the city of Chicago, which is the wrong direction.
Yeah, they're going in instead of out. Yes, but that's okay. When Harry Met Sally is my favorite movie of all time. Like, I have seen it. I have not gone longer than 6 months of what it is a movie when I am alone in my house, which feels more and more rare these days. But like when I'm alone in my house, like it is a movie that I will put on for 20 minutes while I'm like cleaning, tidying, or like I'll have it in like whatever. But so, and listen, it's a love letter. It is part of why I think I was always like, I'm moving to New York. Like it is a love letter to New York City. There is so much about it that is so New York, the New York of it all. But also my best friend from college, Megan, and I, like, she also really loved it because it is our culture. And so when she turned like 25, she lived here in the city, and we did like a day of like where we just like went to every place, which was so much fun.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like iconic when you go into Katz's Deli, which is where she fakes the orgasm. There is a sign like hanging from the ceiling pointing down at the table, and it says, "Here is where Harry and Sally had lunch." Like, it's very cute. But I do want to just say that for my birthday, which was a couple of weeks ago, Eric bought me Nora Ephron at the Movies, which is a like really beautiful coffee table style book so Nora Ephron is fucking genius. Like she wrote When Harry Met Sally, she wrote Sleepless in Seattle, she wrote You've Got Mail. Like she is, amazing. She wrote a bunch of memoirs. She's terrific in a lot of ways. And this book, it's a coffee table book. So at first glance, you're like, oh, this is just going to be like pictures of movie stuff, like stills. But what it really is about is both like the rom-com and how she like made the rom-com into a legitimate art form, and also about feminism in Hollywood, because she was so instrumental in like bringing the female point of view to Hollywood. So
That's
I feel
cool.
like, listen, if you are out there and you too love When Harry Met Sally, or you are interested in like the rom-com as a concept or feminism in Hollywood, this is the book for you. We'll put it in show notes. It's called Nora Ephron at the Movies.
Very cool.
Anyway, welcome everyone to Fated Mates. I'm Sarah McLean. I read romance novels and I write them.
And I'm Jennifer Prokop, a romance reader and editor. And it's 2025.
2025.
Oh, this is why I brought this up, because, she's at the point where she's like, and I'm going to be 40.
Oh, no. It's heartbreaking, that scene, every time for me.
Yeah, I was like, God, I saw this. So
He
the
says,
first time I saw this.
She says, someday.
And he's like, 8 years. I know. And I just was like, I saw that so far ahead of 40. And now
Weird when you're old enough to be Sally's mom.
I can't even talk about it, honestly.
No, my big sadness every time I watch that movie is the Carrie Fisher and Bruno Kirby of it all, which is like they are both geniuses and lost to us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so When Harry Met Sally, you watched When Harry Met Sally, you watched Moonstruck, and you watched Sleepless in Seattle.
We started while you were sleeping. And one of the things I forgot. Yeah. One of the things I forgot, and I was this way too as a kid, is like, although he's not really a kid anymore, Little Romance cannot stand watching something where someone is headed for like being embarrassed in front of everyone.
Oh.
So, right, the entire plot of While You Were Sleeping, like he was like this, like, oh my God, what is she doing, right? But then, so we started that, it was a false start, and then we watched Moonstruck the next night, and he like looked at me like very quickly, and he was like, wait, is this another movie about her falling in love with the brother? And I was like, it is. I don't think I had actually thought about them in this way together.
Installed our buttons these
right?
days.
And then we also started Almost Famous, which is a movie I love. And we just like sort of both fell asleep. But like we got through the scene where he, the lead singer is Russell, I think his name is like drunk at the party, like completely on drugs, and like jumps off the pool. And then they sing Tiny Dancer in the bus. And I was like, you've seen everything you need to. It's fine.
Wait, I can't remember if I said this on the podcast or not, but we watched... my daughter, I felt at 11 was old enough for Bridget Jones. So we watched Bridget Jones this year, and it was a big hit.
Yeah.
So, and like what was very funny is if you've ever been around a kind of 10, 11-year-old, they do a lot of like silent thinking. But it's very loud. Like you sort of know they're thinking. So we were walking somewhere over the last couple of weeks, and she was silent, and I knew she was thinking, and you just sort of sit through it and wait, you know something's coming. And she said, Mom, you know what the funniest part of Bridget Jones is? And I said, tell me. And she said, it's when her and the guy the guy she works with. And I was like, Daniel? She says, yes. I said, and she goes, it's when they're about to have sex and he finds out she's wearing those like big weird underwear. She's wearing basically like spanks. And it's so funny because that scene happened and I was like, oh, like this is maybe like not super duper appropriate for an 11-year-old, but like it cuts away. It's right. It's obvious that they're going to have sex, but like it's not anything graphic. And then I was like, ironic that she totally got the humor
of that. Yeah.
And like remembered he's like, oh no, let me have a look. I happen to be wearing something very similar myself. It's a very hilarious line. And she like got it and I was like, oh, this is going to be great.
The other thing that's really funny about these movies is like both Sleepless in Seattle and When Harry Met Sally feature a Rolodex.
Oh, yeah. Marie's Rolodex. Marie pulls it out at lunch.
Yeah. But we'd watched Sleepless in Seattle first, and he was like, what is that? And I was like,
I know.
And it took a long time for me to explain it. And then I had to like bring up an image where like you could see like that, like someone had written the thing on the card now. And he was like, oh, and then when she brings it out and she's like married, like, but it was like a lot of, I mean, that's the other part too, just like describing
all the answer machine bits. Of course.
Both. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Like the technology or the lack of technology.
The Sleepless in Seattle of it all with the tickets and
the radios and the right? You're like, what's happening?
Call-in radio. We don't have that. I wish we did. You guys, what I wouldn't do for a way to do a call-in episode of Favorite Mates where you just dial in, which I know you can probably, like we could just have a Zoom and people could come, but like it would be more fun if it was like long-time listener, first-time caller.
Dr. Marsha Fieldstone. So, Sarah, we're talking about The Proposition by Judith Ivory this week, a book that sometimes everybody, when you've been reading romance for a really long time, as I have, sometimes you're like, I did not read that. And then you pick it up and you read it and you're like, yeah, I read that. I read that 25 years ago and I just didn't remember or whatever.
Did you read it?
No, I did not have that experience. When I read this book, I was like, no, I did not read this.
I should say there's also the other option, which I had with Jenny Cruzy's Bet Me, which was I've definitely read that. And then I read it and I was like, I have not read this book.
Sure. I mean, that's how it goes. The
romance is like this.
The yin and yang of the romance reader right there. But no, I did not have that experience. So Sarah, this book is from, I looked it up. It was 1999 or 2000. So
I know it was later than I thought. And it's later. It continues to be later than I thought. Like this book feels older than it is.
So talk to us about, since you're, this is like your choice.
This is my pick.
Tell us about it.
There are a few things going on here in the world. Maybe you've noticed, everybody, that everybody's talking about historical romance like it's frickin' dead.
Yeah.
And it's not. And we have an episode coming soon. I'm not going to get super duper into it, but it felt really important to me that and we picked this read along months ago because we've sort of been lax on read alongs, but it felt really important to me when we did a couple months ago that we pick a strong historical as our next read along. And that's tricky. It's not tricky. There are lots of strong historicals, but it's tricky finding one that you think there will be a lot to say, like an hour's worth of let's talk about it. And we've never talked about Judith Ivory. I would really love for her to be a Trailblazer interview because I think she has a lot. She's really interesting because I think she's one of these people who, when you talk to longtime historical readers, everybody has a Judith Ivory book that really hits for them. And there are all different ones. There's Beast and there's Black Silk. And there are all these kind of, I think once you've read a Judith Ivory book, if it hits, you then read lots of them. And I think if you read The Proposition and you loved it, I recommend going to Beast and Black Silk and others. But she's somebody who is pretty unsung. She just, you don't hear, she's not said in the same way as all the other J names.
The J's,
she's not and now I'm realizing maybe the reason why is because she actually post date. For me, in my head, she lives with those names.
Right, but maybe she's after, right.
But she post dates them, and so she came through with those 90s era, late 90s era historical people. She came through with Lisa Kleypas and Julia Quinn and Eloisa James and Stephanie Lawrence, and it was just this time when the books were just dominating the historical. There were this handful of truly dominating historical names, and I wonder if she just sort of got swept up in that.
Well, I also think it has to do with, I hate to say it, with longevity, right? So she has 5 books essentially from 1998 to 2002. And then there's a reissue.
She has a different name.
She has a different name, right? So that's the Judith Ivory. And then Judy Cuevas is her other name. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I also feel look, the truth is sometimes.
Yep. People get lost.
Yeah. Right. It's just you just had a powerhouse 5 or 6 books, and unless people really remember them, it's very easy for them. You know what I mean? Romance is there's a lot of bodies on that road.
Yep.
I don't know how else to say it, right?
No, 1,000%. And there are a number of, how many times do you and I sit around and go hey, do you remember fill in the blank, and something will click. So here's the deal, though. For me, The Proposition is, for a long time, I would have said, do you remember The Proposition? Not do you remember Judith Ivory, right? So The Proposition was really fascinating to me. First of all, it's a Pygmalion retelling. It's My Fair Lady retelling. It's a Trading Spaces retelling.
That for me was the one where I was wait, is this very much Trading?
It's a little Trading Spaces. There's Trading Places. Sorry, not Trading Spaces. I love a Pygmalion story. I think we can talk, and I expect that we will get into the sort of class consciousness of it all. I think it really only works now with this gender flop. I think it's trickier when it's
right.
When it's My Fair Lady style. so there was that, right? There was just sort of I really love it. And I think this is so much a true retelling of Pygmalion, like a real Pygmalion retelling of Pygmalion's in the book. Like,
right. Yes, right.
She's telling
very
you,
self-aware that it is that's
exactly,
what it's doing,
which
right.
is very cool. And then I think for me, what I have always said is, do you remember the one with the rat catcher? Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's how this book lives in my mind. And it lives in my mind that way because a rat catcher as a hero feels impossible. Like, it feels like a mountain I could not climb as a writer. And so we're not talking about Derek Craven. Like, so, okay. We talk a lot about how, like, Derek Craven and Lisa Kleypas are...
Which was 94.
Right?
Yeah.
So in 1994, Lisa writes Dreaming of You. And then she writes, like, this is within the so she writes Dreaming of You. She then writes all the Bow Street Runners books. Like, and then she writes a bunch of heroes. She gets, like, kind of deep into these kind of heroic these heroes who are blue collar and pull themselves up out of the gutter, right? Derek Craven is kind of the primordial, like, the first of his name in that way, because he was literally born in a drain pipe. The problem is Derek, and listen, there is no problem with Derek, but Derek, somewhere between being born in a drain pipe and meeting Sarah on page 1 of Dreaming of You, pulls himself out of the drain pipe.
He's done it all that work on his own already, right? Yeah.
What happens here in the proposition is Mick is in the drain pipe still. And so, I mean, he makes enough money to send his money home to his family. Like, we're going to get into all of it. But there is a sort of sense that this is a man who is in his 30s, or he is 30 years old, and he is a rat catcher in London in the 1890s. And this is bananas, like, as a concept, right? Because this is not, but it is also like, heroes should be kings, and no one is a king like Mick is a king, right? And it's really fascinating as a study of heroes. But before we get into it, and I know you have something to say, but I want to say that I spoke to somebody in publishing who was involved in publishing this book. And she told me that when they wrote the cover copy for it, they deliberately left out his job because they couldn't sell it. They knew they wouldn't be able to sell it with, and, like, this is for everybody to know, like, there are a lot of times that you leave things out of cover copy. I have seen widow books have widowhood written out of cover copy. Like, there are things that, like, you're making cereal box, right? When you write cover copy or you design a cover.
Especially in 1999. There's no Goodreads. There's only word of mouth.
No one will ever know he's a rat catcher.
And what you're, right, reading on the back of the book in Barnes & Noble, in the Borders, right?
So anyway, what were you going to say about Mick?
Here's here's what I was just going to say, like, kind of broadly. One of the things that was one of the things that's very interesting to do is read a 25-year-old historical romance and realize, like, it really, I think, helps explain our, like, ongoing thesis, which is historical romance is not historical fiction. It tells you way more about the time it was written than it does about the setting, right? Because so in some ways, right, like, what felt like some of the politics of this book, I'll say, kind of felt dated, or it felt like there were things that I kind of expected or knew would happen that if the book was being written today, it would not have to happen that way, right? And so, like, for example, I mean, I think we'll talk about, like, sex. I think that's part of it, but I think their interaction between them. But I also think, like, the ending, right? Like, how it ends, where Mick ends up. I don't think it would have had to have ended that way if it was written today, right? Like,
I get it.
Right? Does that make sense? And So I think like that's one of the other things is it's kind of like when we, like what's the work of historical romance versus contemporary romance, right? Like you're still processing. Romance is always processing now. Like I really believe that, right? Historical romance just lets the author do that at a little bit more of a remove.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that's like really interesting to me, I was really interested in the fact that it was written in Victorian, right? In the 1890s versus like pure Regency. And I was like, here's a book that to me, it was published in December of 1999.
Mm-hmm.
It is really thinking about like to me, it felt like very clear it was processing like our anxiety and angst about entering into a new century in a way, right? Like sort of like what will be the case? How will the rules change? What will society be like?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I felt like it was interesting to me that feels like a part of the time of the book, and that felt purposeful, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't,
Yes.
it's not Gilded Age, right? It's Victorian, but in a very like also like really specific and kind of funny way. Like, right. The mention of like, there's like a whole thing where they're talking about like the Victorian era and how repressive it was. And yet Victoria had all these children and right. Like all of the ways in which I found myself really interested in that, I think is, I don't know, just something. I think we'll talk more about historicals like later at the end of the month, but like that to me was also just like really fascinating to have the setting be not the Regency. And I was like, well, why this period of time?
I mean, I think there are a few reasons for that outside of all this, and that is, I don't know where I want to begin, but there is the evolution of Winnie.
Oh yeah.
Is so Victorian in like you couldn't set it in the Regency and show it quite the way she does. Like the way Winnie comes, I don't want to say undone because it feels like she doesn't come undone. She sort of just like knits herself. She becomes a completely different person by the end of the book.
Right.
And like and that evolution is not a Regency evolution.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is brought to you by A.E. Merriweather, author of Marin in the Moonlight.
So Marin has come from a very high-achieving family that disapproves of her and everything that she loves. And so she is just done with it. So she heads off to her favorite place in the universe, a place called Revel Point, which is a theme park that revolves around the Revel universe, a kind of big media property. While there, she begins work as Rose Red, who is her favorite Revel character. And she finally feels like she has found herself and she's found her people. And she's so happy. There's a dreamy guy in the works. And everything is perfect until the interim CEO of Revel Point is nearly drowns in the lighthouse moat, and Marin is there to save him. Of course, what happens is Ethan is this like really cantankerous kind of jerk who doesn't seem to be that interested in the Revel universe, but is there because his brother has died, and this was his brother's dream. So he's there to run this company and finish an immersive Island of Sirens experience for our mermaid lovers out there. And he needs help. He needs somebody who knows this universe and can help him like really knock this out of the park. So the two of them work together despite a power-hungry stepmother in the wings who wants to sabotage the project and their budding relationship. And as they kind of face the twists and turns of this contemporary Little Mermaid retelling, the big question will be, can you take a fairy tale romance and make it the real thing?
So if you would like this contemporary romance set in a theme park with chosen family, fake dating, and a workplace romance, then Marin in the Moonlight might be for you. If you click on the chapter title right now, you'll be taken to buy the book. Thanks to A.E. Merriweather for sponsoring this week's episode.
Should we just begin straight at the beginning with the mustache?
I mean, if we must, I would say. I was literally like, oh my God. Be in our books. All these fucking mustache people are going to love this.
They're going to flip out. It's so good. No, shut up. It's so good. Not because it's a mustache, but because of what the mustache represents, Jen.
I guess. His lionhearted virility.
So, I mean, we've sort of gone over the plot, but I'll do a quick plot recap. So, Mick Tremore is a Cornish rough rat catcher who lives in Whitechapel, which is where Jack the Ripper happened, for those of you who don't know. Just to give you a vibe of Mick. He moved to London years ago from Cornwall, where he has a very, very thick, very unique Cornish accent. He's big as a house. We love him for it. And he is known, he is just a good, solid, like if you have mice or rats in your business or home, Mick is who you call. He comes with a dog, some ferrets. No, a few ferrets, a few dogs, but like one ferret and one dog who are very important.
Do you think Sherry Thomas's guy with the dormouse in his pocket was a reference to Mick?
Maybe. We could ask her. She would probably tell us. Yeah.
Right? I mean like this was first, right?
Yeah,
this came before.
This came before. There, I think right? 10 years earlier, Sherry also has like a really like encyclopedic knowledge of the genre. She definitely read the proposition. Okay. So Mick, we meet Mick in a dress shop right at the very start because there are mice in the dress shop and Mick has come to...
No, he was romancing the shop girl out in the alley.
Oh, and you're right.
And then here's the screaming.
I don't even know. I'm bad at plot.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, he's outside in the back alley. There's like, whatever. He's being Mick. He's being virile in the back alley, though not untoward. And so he hears the screaming. He goes in. He just happens to be a rat catcher. There are mice in this thing. They're climbing the crinolines of this lady's skirts. And he and his ferret find the mouse. And he does this very sort of sweet talky, like, oh yeah, come to me, little mouse. It's very hot. Whatever. I don't know. Jen's making a face. Whatever. This book installed my buttons. Listen, Eric will tell you if there is a mouse in this house, it is not hot. There is only panic. But anyway, so while he's down there on the ground doing this, he looks into the dressing room and he sees a pair of legs. Nobody likes legs the way.
Oh yeah,
Mick likes legs. I mean,
he's a leg man.
He sees legs that go all the way to the floor, as we say, and he is just like, holy cannoli. During all of this, he also is thinking about his mustache and its representation of his lionhearted virility. Listen, lionhearted virility is the greatest. This is the greatest description of anything ever. He has he has a Tom Selleck lip, everybody. It's thick. The mustache is thick and pelty. And he's very proud of it. Oh. Very, very, very proud of it because it represents his lionhearted virility. Anyway, back to the book. He sees these legs. The legs leave and he decides, and then he gets like hit up by, some baroness or something who offers him, clearly is like, I would like to take you to bed.
Rough, yeah.
And instead he sort of demurs and she says, well, what if I bought a pair of garters for your woman,
your lady friend,
your lady friend. And he's like, send the garters to, with legs. The dress that belongs to those legs. Cut to like minutes later. The legs are now in an ice cream shop, in like a tea shop. And the legs belong to Edwina Balish. And Edwina is like having a lovely time. She's had some dresses tailored. She's now in this tea shop. She's having a nice time. And then all hell breaks loose. And in runs this gigantic man with a mustache, a thick, pelty mustache. His clothes like basically, like, his buttons are undone. He's like he's being chased. There's a lot going on because poor Mick has been, he's being chased by the shopkeep's uncle.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just chaos. There's a lot going on. So they run into this. Then the chase ends up, speaking of Bridget Jones, very similar to the scene in the Greek restaurant where they run in. Tables are upended. Then the waiters, it's sort of a crazy.
It's like it was really interesting reading that because it was so, I felt like I was watching an old movie.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the whole vibe of these scenes. Yes.
Chasing around. I forget what that
I know, like
my show is called. Like Benny Hill. Like,
yeah, right. Like just like all this madcap energy. And I was really like, oh, I was not really expecting this.
Push him to the ground and he's shouting and no one can understand what he's saying because he has such a thick, like weird accent. Except Edwina is immediately like, oh my God. He's fascinating. I've never heard such an accent. And she is a linguist. So she is.
Yes.
She specializes. She is the Rex Harrison character in My Fair Lady. She specializes in like language. She wants to record him. She wants him like. She's suddenly like, I've never heard anything like this, but she can immediately place him as being Cornish. And she's fascinated. So she becomes his like immediate translator, which is really fascinating.
Yes.
Like, there's this really interesting moment.
Because what does he keep saying instead of yes? I can't remember. Right? Like they keep asking questions and he's basically like saying yes, but she's the only one who recognizes that that's what he's saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And so it all becomes, whatever. And then there happen to be these two men who are in the tea shop, brothers, and they immediately sense that like they're presented to us as people who love wagering, as two brothers who like love betting against each other, and like they have so much money, they're like extravagant, and so they decide they immediately recognize who Edwina is, and they essentially make a bet between them that Edwina can turn Mick into a Viscount within 6 or 8 weeks. I forget the timeline.
Yeah.
And if she can pass him off as a Viscount at a particular ball thrown by a duke, one of them wins. And if she can't, the other one wins. And then, of course, Edwina will get paid and Mick will get paid. And then.
Now, the interesting part is. At first, like Mick's just like not going to get anything.
No, the POV in this scene is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because Mick is not, again, like this is one of those things where like the choice is really interesting because Mick is on page, but we are not in his brain.
Right.
And you almost forget he's there.
Well, because they have forgotten he's there. He's just like, and this is when I really was like, wait, is this a Trading Places retelling? Right? Because in Trading Places with Eddie Murphy, right, like there's these two brothers who are just constantly betting and they essentially make this bet. Although in their bet, it's like the two will trade places, right? Like we'll bring up Eddie Murphy and we'll send down Dan Aykroyd. But I was like, so these two like sort of bickering brothers, right? Like kind of arguing about this stuff. It just was. And I was kind of like, but Mick himself has to be the one who's like, and what about old Mick? Like, what am I going to get out of this? I'm not doing any of this if I don't get paid, right?
And they're like £100. And that's a shitload of money.
Well, he bargains them up, I think.
Oh, does he?
Yeah.
Remember.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that scene to me is he realizes, like, with the kind of money on the table that they're looking to spend, like, I think they say 25 and he says, I think there's some bickering back and forth. It doesn't matter. But the point is like, he comes into the scene and we realize, like, he's not just going to let himself be.
No.
Right.
Well, because Mick is a king, Jen.
Yeah, of course.
Always. He's always in charge. And so there is the story. Right. And then from there, we get Edwina and Mick. Mick moves into Edwina's house.
Yeah.
And they start lessons.
Right.
And it's really fascinating because it becomes very quickly clear that Mick is incredibly brilliant, a very good student, he can read, there's all this stuff that like people don't expect from old Mick. And then Edwina starts, and then obviously from there, it goes the way everybody would expect. These two fall for each other. And there's a class issue. And like, there's this kind of, so I don't want to do any more plot because I want to get into like the actual conversation about the book. Because I don't think there is much more plot except that the Duke, it becomes clear, not immediately, but pretty quickly, that Edwina is the Duke's. Edwina grew up in this, the Duke is throwing this ball. The Duke is in his 90s. And her father should have been Duke, which would have made her Lady Edwina Balish, which is her title. But she would have been daughter to the Duke and had a very, very, very different life. But instead, her father died and the dukedom passed. She does not have a brother. The dukedom passed to a distant cousin who is now the Duke. And who she does not care for and does not have a good relationship with. But this house where the ball is being thrown is the house that she grew up in. So I think there's a really interesting, I would say we'll get into, I'm sure, that piece of the puzzle. But I really love the way Ivory lay that motivation over the top of the whole thing so that it felt like Edwina had skin in the game. More than, because again, I think the problem, and I haven't seen My Fair Lady in a long time, so if it's your favorite movie and I'm totally getting it wrong, I apologize. But like in My Fair Lady, it feels like it's just to prove that Rex Harrison can. But in this situation, Edwina feels like, it would make her feel better to stick it to this Duke. Because he has been so unkind to her.
The sticking it to this Duke, this cousin of hers, is she doesn't want that to be public, right? Because she can't humiliate him. It can't be that. It has to be like the knowledge. It's like purely internal for her. Like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to put this imposter in the house and I'm going to teach him how to talk and how to sit at a table and how to dance and charm people. And I will know that I did it because that will be the only way that I could ever.
Personal.
Right? Yeah.
It's personal.
Yeah.
And we learn really quickly that like, that's all Edwina has, right?
Yeah.
She's wearing kind of old dresses that she has like altered and refitted to like be a little more modern, but she's like two servants, a cook and a butler. She lives in, a nice home, but, it's modest. Everything she works, she gets paid. She's basically, her job is to do this, right? Like she takes young women who are titled or who have come into money, but have not learned social graces. And she teaches them how to speak properly. And so she has a career, she has a reputation, but she is 29 years old and she is on the shelf and she is very, at best, plain looking, at worst, maybe unattractive, very tall, very slim, sort of like can't see her way through to like feeling like she has any real value outside of her ability to help people chameleon into society.
Correct. Yeah. Well, and I think, when thinking about it, to me, that was the other really compelling timeline thing that allowed to happen, which is like, had this been the Regency, had it been 80 years earlier or whatever, her living alone,
she wouldn't have had
Mick
a job,
being right. Like I think that setup required it being just like later. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I totally got that.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Mila Finelli, author of Empire of Temptation, the first in a brand new small town mafia series.
Yeah, so this is the New York State of Mafia series in which Italian mafiosos, for mafia romance reasons, are transplanted into New York and shenanigans ensue.
Into the Hudson Valley.
Into the
Darling.
Hudson Valley.
So picturesque.
And in this case, we have Luca, who is essentially being blackmailed to go to the States and essentially kidnap a young woman named Valentina and bring her back to Italy. And it turns out that her father was like a mafia assassin, and people have been on the hunt for him, and they didn't realize that, who she was, but now they found her, right? And so Luca shows up in this tiny little town and goes into her restaurant, which is like this generations old Italian restaurant, and realizes that this young woman is in real trouble, right? Her chef is about to quit. No one's in the restaurant. And so he decides, before taking her back to Italy and ruining her life, that maybe he should essentially be her mafia fairy goddaddy, as one would say. And, like, help her find a new chef and help her find people to renovate the restaurant and, like, sort of get everything in order. And he is immediately, of course, in that Mila Finelli way. It's age gap, insta love, insta lust in a big way. And so, he takes her around New York. He, like, fixes things at the restaurant. And she, of course, is really trying to figure out, why am I so into this older man, and what would what would everybody say about the fact that I am totally having the hots for this guy who could be my father's age?
Well, if you would like to find out exactly what happens when you have the hots for somebody who could be your father's age, then this book is for you. Empire of Temptation is available right now in print, ebook, audiobook, or with your monthly subscription to Kindle Unlimited. And if your podcasting app supports it, you can click on the chapter title right now and be taken to buy the book. Thanks to Mila Finelli for sponsoring this week's episode. All right, well, first we have to talk about Mick, because he is a historical hero who is unlikely.
Sarah's like, where do I start?
He's such a delight. Like, he's so great because he doesn't. Here's the thing. You could expect that this would all feel really squicky. Like, yeah, here's this man, there's this class thing, there's a wager. It all feels in the wrong hands. This book ends up feeling like everybody's kind of like manipulating Mick and like, right, mocking, class difference, and like really taking a swipe at deeply working class people. But actually what happens here is we see that Mick immediately identifies, the way that this wager will set him up for more. But it's interesting because he never comes to, I'll be a gentleman, right? What he comes to at the end is he has a plan, which is he's going to go somewhere and be a valet, right?
Yes, right.
He's got a job lined up. He's going to stop being a rat catcher.
Well, and this is something that happens with the butler's help, right? Like,
we'll talk about the butlers where he sleeps first.
Yeah, I mean, so it just was really funny because it's not necessarily that Mick was like, I want to stop being a rat catcher and be a valet, but in the process of doing this is like, oh, I could
be a valet. I could make more money. I could have my own, like, I could have a home. I could have a life. I could be, and so there's sort of a sense that he's aware at the beginning that this will open a door, but he's not aware of what the door will be. And then when he gets to the place where he's like, I see a door opening, it's one level up on like a social ladder, but it's still like he would be moving from like very working class to servant class, but like high up in servant class. Like a valet is like, that's a valuable like servant, in the house. And I think like there's what's fascinating about it is that at no point does it feel like what Judith Ivory is saying is like Mick has to not be, poor.
Oh, yeah, no, of course. Right.
Until the very, very end, which we'll get to. So so there's that. But also there is this sense that Mick knows the world. He knows so much more than Edwina does.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
He has seen so much more. He has done so much more. And he is going, for every lesson she teaches him about how to aspirate his H's or,
Right.
speak, perfect that particular vowel. He is like, let me tell you how this is going to go, how the world really is. And I think that this is set up immediately in that very first scene with the two of them where she asks him to shave off his mustache.
Yeah.
Which is very clearly about, we've already established, he has already established that for Mick, his mustache is like his whole identity. Like it represents his virility, his lionhearted virility, his masculinity. Like it is the thing about his appearance that he is most proud of. He brushes it out every day. He oils it. He's like, this mustache is well cared for.
I wish everyone could see the look on my face. Like all this talk of mustaches, even I'm like, ugh, gross.
And she's like, get that fucking thing off your face. Right? Like the first thing she says to him is like, if we're going to pass you off as a Viscount, you have to shave that. And he's like the king, the prince regent. Like
right.
Albert has a mustache.
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, no, but it's not like your mustache.
You're like, cute, cool story.
So she's like, you have to shave it off. And he's like, I'm not doing that unless you give me something too. And then there is this question of like, well, what could Edwina Ballish really give?
Yeah,
Mick
right.
Tremore?
What would be?
Right?
Yeah.
Because she doesn't have, she's like, I don't have any money. Like, she doesn't have anything. And he's like, yeah, but you got legs. And so they have this, they do this dance, which becomes the first like sexual scene in the book.
Yeah.
Where he's like, I want you to lift your skirts for me. And there's a long back and forth about
yes. What will that mean?
What he will do to, like, what she will have to do in order to get him to shave his mustache. Is this before or after the bath? When he like fights the butler about the bath?
It's after. I mean, because that's
perfect.
like the first,
that's
like the first
silly,
coming in the door, right?
So, and so basically he's like, I want you to lift your skirts. I want to see your legs. And then it's like, I want to kiss your legs.
Yeah. I'm going to touch them.
I want to touch them. I want that. It needs to be higher than, like, there's a discussion of like how high, like to the knee, to the, where, what is he going to touch? And then like, what happened? Like, can he, like, and it is intense. It is so intense that Edwina cries. And I think this is really fascinating because I think this is a scene that you and I like kind of texted about where you were like, I don't think this would be written this way.
I don't think it would be written this way today.
And I think you're right. But because I think now the perception of this scene could be like, oh, this is like, she's not consenting. And I think she cries because he's like, I mean, she's never felt it. She's never had this, like, this level of, like, the whole thing is pulled so tight. Like, the tension in this scene is pulled so, so tight. And listen, this could be that I cut my teeth on, Jude Devereaux. But it feels like this isn't about lack of consent. This is about, like, she doesn't even, like, she can't comprehend.
Exactly.
This ever happening, ever in her life.
I mean, I think this is the part, before we get to, like, what Mick's agenda is in this scene, she, I think, is like, I was really interested in Winnie in this scene, right? Like, so she's coming into the scene where she's like, I just cannot stand this mustache. And I was like, girl, I am with you. Get that thing off his face. I'm like, when you said pelt earlier, I was like, I'm going to die. Like, I just don't. Okay. What? Okay. Anyway.
So what you're saying is you did not find it a representation of lionhearted virility.
I mean, whatever, sir. Anyway, I like whatever. I don't want to get into it. I just don't feel this way about mustaches, everyone. I just don't. Anyway, but the part that was interesting is she essentially views everything about Mick up to this point as she has the upper hand.
Yep.
Because he is a rat catcher and she is a lady. Mm-hmm. And even though she's not a snob in that way, right? Like, it is built into her system to think right. I'm smarter than him. I'm better than him. I have the upper hand. And so this is a scene where that gets completely swept out from under her, and in a way she does not understand. I mean, and you have to, and this is it. Like, y'all, like, one of the things I find really fascinating about this is, here it is 150 years earlier. Like, she literally does not know a thing about her own body, right? Like, she's never looked at her own self before. She has no idea, like, what sex, what sex is. Like, I mean, she knows nothing. And so the thing about this moment, too, is you have to understand, we live in a society right now where people are like, yeah, that's how it should be. Let's go back to that.
Mhm.
Right. And that's why, like, this is such a powerful scene to me, because what she's doing is essentially like, and he's aware of this differential, but not, I think, to that extent, because his experience with women has been,
especially women of title and money,
this class, is they know they want a little bit of rough, and they come to me and they hire me to catch the rats, and then they take me upstairs.
And he just thinks this is a game.
This is a game to him. I don't think he really has. I mean, he knows that she's a virgin. He knows, but he doesn't really know.
But also, Jen, there's no way. No, Mick does not in this scene think he is getting any further than, like,
no, of course not,
the tops of her legs.
Right, of course not. I mean, and because it's such a, like, spirited discussion about, like, how it's going to work, and then it's going to be 10 minutes here, and then they're going to go up and then,
and there's, right, like,
that and so I think that's part of the reason. A thing that I'm really fascinated by is the way we read it now. It's not like dubious consent in the sense that, like, that's what the author and we, the readers, are experiencing. Like, right? Like, does that make sense? Like, it's really literally like it's cross purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm fascinated by it because I do think it felt so much riskier.
Yeah. Once you get through the rest of the next scenes, like all the other scenes where they have sexual encounters, and it takes a while for them to get to, like, really anything. Although that's the scene when, is that the scene when, like, he gets her off with just his hand? Does he do that?
He touches her and she is like,
and then she's like, what? And then she cries, and he like consoles her, and while he's consoling her, he licks his palm. And listen, everybody.
I was like, oh, she had no idea. No idea what was even happening.
Right. So he's holding her, and he has touched her core.
Yeah.
To use a historical term. And he licks his palm, and you're in his POV, and it is the rawest, horniest. Listen, these girls on TikTok have no idea what horny means until they have read Mick Tremore licking his palm after barely touching her. And it is like, suddenly you are like, oh, we are in a different class of hero here.
Yeah.
Like, I can't name another hero who would do that, Jen.
Oh, no. Inconceivable,
like,
Sarah.
I can't. Like, I don't think I can think of another romance hero who would do that.
No.
And so, like, that in itself is like, hats off, Judith Ivory. Like, I mean, it is so horny. Through all of this, there's the game of, like, teaching him what we all know Pygmalion. There's the game of, like, making him into a Viscount. It works, right? Like, he's getting better and better and better and better. He shaves off his mustache. He puts on new clothes. He, like, learns how to tie a cravat, and, like, suddenly he's just looking like a completely different man. He looks like an aristocrat, and he's, like, really selling it. At the same time, the butler is like, he cannot live above stairs. Like, what is happening here? And I sort of love it. Gives me a little bit of, like, Lord of Scoundrels vibes, because the butler is sort of used as this character who we don't really see him very much, but, like, he has opinions.
Yeah.
And he's really through his opinions, we are seeing, like, the shift in Edwina, right? In the same way that through Dane's friends in Lord of Scoundrels, we see the shift in Dane. So he's like, he moves downstairs below into the servants' quarters, like. Anyway, all of this is happening, but then at the same time, we start to see Winnie. Edwina becomes Winnie, which is has always been a name that has bothered her because she has had cousins who called her Winnie because she looks like, thought it was hilarious because she looks like a horse, because she has like a really long like nose, and she's very like kind of sinewy and like she's very strong, but not, she looks like a horse and she's horsey. And so they thought it was funny to call her Winnie. But like now when Mick calls her Winnie, it's like he cares for her.
Right. It's an endearment almost. Yeah.
He starts to care for her like real fast. And there's that too, the sort of sense of like he's falling for her. And
before you go on, I think the other thing though that I think is like really interesting about this book, and I feel like it goes back to that scene with the legs, right? Is when he renames her, right? She is like, I never saw myself this way. Right. So like after, like, she's literally like I think like you have to understand already. She's like, my legs. Why the fuck would he want to see my legs? Mm-hmm. And then there's this scene where she's like looking at herself afterwards.
Yep.
And she's like, I do have nice legs.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. She starts to really like feel herself.
Yes. And I think that is part of the reason that like the scene playing out, like, again, it's hard for me to imagine it being written that way today, right? Like, I just think that it's too clear that, like, his knowledge is so much greater than hers about, like, what's really happening. And I just think that it feels like it would be hard to see a hero, like, the perception would be like him taking advantage of her, or right, like dubious consent or whatever, right? But in this moment, instead, what we realize is no one has ever been interested in her in any kind of way before. She has never been interested in herself this way. She's almost 30, right? That magical, I'm going to turn 30 in this book, right? And like, it's going to be an awakening. But I mean, that scene where she like looks at her own legs in the mirror, I thought was just like really amazing.
Yeah.
And you can't get there. You can't get there without going through that.
How much he wants to see her legs.
Yeah. Right. And I think the other thing that's like,
it
really
would never, until that moment, Edwina Balish has never looked at herself in the mirror.
No.
She has avoided looking at herself.
Right.
In the mirror.
And that's why like the horsey thing made me think of it, right? Like the payoff of that scene, like, yes, obviously like the raw horniness of like him like licking his hand while he's like comforting her, right? He knows he's pushed her too far, right?
Unreal.
But the other part of that scene, one that has a far longer, like more interesting like direction to me, is her then being like, wait a minute, maybe there's more to me. Maybe, and it's not, and yes, I guess it's like male gaze in a way, but it's not, right? It's like her in her own room, like lifting them up. And what she admires about her legs is like, they're strong, like they're, right? Like it's a really fascinating, I don't know. I just really was like, there's a lot of payoff to that scene in a way that I did not really expect.
This week's episode of Fated Mates is sponsored by Max Monroe, author of What I Should Have Said.
So Nora Ellis is about to get married, and the problem is like she doesn't really love the guy she's about to marry. He was picked out by her mother, who was terrible. And so on her wedding day, she is like literally in her dress when she discovers this envelope that has such like incendiary like information in it that she feels she has no choice but to become a runaway bride. So she literally runs out on her own wedding and heads for Vermont, which is where her sister lives. And she kind of gets a ride into town with Bennett Bishop, who is basically like the town grump. And they have like a real enemies to lovers vibe at first. She's not sure who she can trust. And, you know, he is just like kind of like the stoic, quiet type, right? But when he has something to say, it might be something that you are not ready to hear. And so basically the two of them essentially eventually become friends and really uncover like the origin of all the dark secrets that were part of this letter that sent her running away from her own wedding. So summer will never be the same for these two because they now will have to like face the future, hopefully together, but also with like a huge dramatic woo over the top thing.
That's right. What I Should Have Said will contain all of the Max Monroe humor and spice that you know and love, but this one is a deep emotional story and does contain sensitive topics, so check your content warnings before you read it if you need to. You can find What I Should Have Said in print or ebook wherever you get your books. It is out this week, and if your podcasting app supports it, you can click on the chapter title right now to be taken to buy the book. Thanks to Max Monroe for sponsoring this week's episode. It's weird because that scene really unlocks them sexually in a slow burn, like a sort of perfect slow burn, because then we start to see them kind of dance around each other and he says to her, when you are able to ask for what you want, I will give it to you, right? Which is, again, a sort of moment of him acknowledging her agency, right? And I think Judith Ivory is trying really hard to like thread this needle of like, it is not the, like all of this is about Winnie. It's about Winnie having to grow, not about Mick. Like Mick could end this book as a rat catcher and still be a fucking king. But Winnie has to come into, to your point, like come into a new age, right?
Yeah.
So then there's this great scene where they are on a bus, right? So they end up, where are they before him? Why am I, they go and they go back to the tea shop
to kind of like practice.
Soft
right?
run.
Yeah. Because at this point, it's like before we get to that, like I actually want to talk about one of the things that's interesting about that scene is, and the book in general, is like we sometimes talk about 3-act structure. This book has a very clear like beginning where they're in the world. Mm-hmm. And then the like most of Act 2 is like the phone booth.
Rings. Yep.
Right? It is just the two of them. And that's why the butler kind of being like, this isn't appropriate anymore. He didn't say a word when Mick was a rat catcher, but once Mick starts to be, right, he can tell. It's really unbelievable what happens when it's just the two of them. They literally are creating their own world for themselves. But you know that a book like this, the whole payoff is we're going to be back in the world, right?
Yes.
And that's the first time we see them giving that a shot.
So wait, but before they get to the tea shop, he says to her in the phone booth part, he's very honest with her. He's basically like, I want you. Like, I want you all the time, any way I can get you. And she's like overwhelmed by him because even if he were, I mean, like, Mick Tremore could be the size of a dormouse and he would still be overwhelming to her, right? Like, it's not about size or scope or any of that. It's just about like everything about him is something she's never even thought to experience before. So he's like, I want you. And then he says this really interesting thing because they have this back and forth where like he kind of gets stroppy with her, as my mom would say, my British mother would say, where he's like, fine, I don't want you. And then immediately he's like, no, I want you so much. You're making me say things that aren't true. Right? Like, and then he says immediately, because in that line, right, he says, you are doing this to me. You are turning me into something I am not. And then he's like, no, wait. Instantly, the next line in the book is, no, I'm wagging my own tongue. Like, immediately taking back anything that would make her think that this was her fault. Like, if he is an asshole, Mick is the asshole. Like, if he is good, Mick is good. There is no way that Edwina is not in this. She is not manipulating. He is doing everything himself. It's really, Judith Ivory makes sure every step of the way that Mick is in charge.
Yeah.
And that in being in charge, he is leaving Edwina to her own agency, right? Because there is a constant sense of Edwina has to ask.
Yeah. like, so there's a scene, and I had highlighted where he says to her, right? He's basically like, I want to kiss you. I want to do a lot of things. And I've been about as forthright as a man gets about it. But it can't be all me every time. Me pushing, me seducing, me making you do what we both know you want to do anyway, right? I can't keep chasing you, right? You have to own this.
Yes.
And I think one of the things, again, that's like very interesting to me about this is, even though that felt, as you said, like him kind of like trying to be as clear as he could, right? There's a way in which it still feels like she doesn't even know what that means still, though, right? Like, I found it very much, and that's like
it. She's confused.
Yeah, right. Like and again, I think that's the part about like the riskiness of
until
it. Until
the bus.
Yeah, like him saying, like, I am being really clear with you about like what I want, and her kind of being like, I'm like, she doesn't know what that means, right?
She doesn't
know what that means.
But then she does.
Yeah.
Like, but here's the thing. I think you're supposed to feel that way, Jen.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like,
agree.
I think that's part of the like delight of this book is she doesn't fucking get it until they go to that tea house and she sees, oh shit, he could pull this off.
Yes, right.
Because in comes the Baroness from the dress shop, who recognizes him but cannot place him.
Correct.
And then she places him in Paris.
Yeah.
And he con mans this lady into believing that, yes, she did know him from Paris. And when she speaks French, instead, he doesn't speak a lick of French. He says, I'm so sorry. My fiancé does not speak French. So I'm going to have to ask you to speak in English, which is so fucking smooth. And Edwina didn't teach him how to do that.
No. Right.
And like and she's like, oh, wait, like he's going to do this. And suddenly she's been left behind in this really interesting way because he could succeed, but she's still just going to be Winnie from the block. Right.
Right.
So they leave the tea shop and they get onto a bus. They leave, they pass her carriage. Like he's not getting back into the carriage. They get onto a bus. The bus is going, to somewhere. I can't remember what neighborhood, but it's going like somewhere, I think, east, right? And they get into the East End of London to this place, a bar, where a tavern, like, and Nick's been there. It's Cheers, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
Everybody knows him. He walks in, Mick.
Right.
Everyone knows him. Everybody's making fun of him for like no longer with the lionhearted virility. Look at your Tony accent. Like everything about you is so posh. Who's this lady? She's so posh. What's going on here? Right. And that's when Edwina is like, we're in her POV and she's like, what is this world? Right. Like, how do I have to learn to be in this world? Because I want to know all of Mick. And that's, to your point, where the switch flips and Edwina suddenly starts to see like, oh, wait, I'm starting to understand the game.
Yeah.
And then the dance happens.
It almost feels a little like she feels like I am here. It's conditional. I can't really join in. You're right. I can drink with them. I can hang out at the table. I can laugh with people, but I can't get up on this table and dance with these women.
Because I'm Edwina Balosh.
Yeah. Right. And yet she loves dancing and she is fascinated by their freedom. Right. Fascinated by the way that she can tell that they have access. I mean, and again,
because it's 1890.
Yeah.
And like
right.
Suddenly the world is women's.
Yeah. And then like she gets pulled up there anyway, right? And
by
she
a charming young woman who's like, just come dance. Just come dance. No one cares.
No one cares. No one cares is not anything Winnie has ever experienced in her life, right?
No. And also, like, there is nowhere safer for Winnie. One, none of these people are ever going to see her again. Two, Mick is there. He's not going to let anything happen to her.
And the thing that's interesting, though, is there is a young aristocrat there, right? So
Yes.
anytime that, and this is like, again, that transition from out of the phone booth into the world, right? Now they're still in Mick's world, but there is this reminder. There's a person there, this man, who is a reminder of the world she's left behind. And it's not that she's worried he's going to identify her or know who she is, but it's just a reminder. Like, if I leave this behind, then, right, like I don't really belong here. I belong with this guy somewhere else in a Mayfair ballroom. And I think it's a fascinating scene in every way, right? Like there's a really interesting part about like taking off her blouse. Right? Like, it's so hot and they are dancing.
Not, and a blouse is slightly, it's not the same, everyone. Like it's an overlay. Because remember, this is Victorian England. They're wearing 17 layers of clothing, right? So it's like a jacket. There's like a coat or a cloak that probably came off when she came in. And then there's a jacket. And then there's a blouse. And then there's a,
right. So
whatever comes next. And then there's a chemise. And then there's a corset. And then a chemise. Anyway, so she's not nude in any way.
No, of course.
Like, removing a layer of clothing in public is a no.
Right. But
no.
She is sweating. And I just found that whole scene.
And she doesn't take it off. The woman does. The woman unbuttons her.
Right. Like, you can do this. It's fine. Because they have all done it. And she's like, no, I couldn't. And then she does. And I just found that whole scene, again, like, really fascinating in the way in which you can do this thing. It's okay. But does she know what? Like, I was really fascinated in the whole book, in the tension between Winnie being like this woman of the world who knows nothing about the world.
I think it really does this beautiful job. This whole book does this beautiful job of like writing characters who are like leaping and the net appears for them, right? Like, but the leap is the hard part, right? Like, and I think that Winnie is constantly in a state, as you say, I keep coming back to you saying like, well, she doesn't know anything. She doesn't know what that means or what that is. And I think you're right. But I also think like it's born of fear. It's born of what will happen if I take this risk, do this thing, take off my blouse, dance on the table, whatever. And I think the magnificent thing in this book is every time Winnie takes a risk, the net appears, right? It's okay.
Winnie, who is of the aristocratic class, her family was able to turn away from her. This man should have taken care of her, right? She should have been able to go to the new Duke's house and have him give her a dowry and like, right. And he just doesn't. And eventually people figure out and are kind of outraged, and he's able to like kind of put her in this one house that wasn't entailed. And, like she can take, but like she has to sell off everything. She's going to really be on the edge. Whereas Mick, who is essentially like the sole breadwinner for his literally 14 brothers and sisters, right? Like, is constantly sending money back. And I think there's another thing that's like really fascinating, and it comes up in this scene, is what she has been told about the benefits of her class. Right? She never was really able to access. And now she's really seeing like, wait, these women are having more fun, right? Like, there's a way in which it's like, it's Pygmalion, and he's the one undergoing the supposed transformation, but she is
transformed. Yeah. And but it's so beautiful. Like when she finally gets up there and she dances and dances and dances and dances until she's sweaty and tired and needs water and then she like comes down and she's so hot, and he takes her out into the alleyway to cool off. And like they make out in the alleyway.
God, yeah,
they do. And it is unbridled and so hot because these two have finally found a place where they can stand on the same footing.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. And
he's like, I mean, again, not to put too fine a point on it, but he's so hot for her. Like, so he is gone for this woman. And he is just like, I want to take you. I want to fuck you here in this alley, but you deserve better. I want to take you home. I want to take you to bed. I want to do terrible, like wicked, wonderful things to you. And then so she's like, yes, yes, like, yes. And then and it's unequivocal. It's like the consent is
at that point, there's no more
ironclad. And they get into where are they? In a carriage.
Well,
the carriage followed the bus. And so they get into the carriage, and then and they're making out a little bit, and then he like settles, and he's like starts to look out the window, and like as they're getting closer and closer to Mayfair, right? Like going back to this world, it's not Winnie who tightens up, it's him, because he starts to realize there is no end game here. Like, he is in love with this woman, and if he fucks her, like, that can't, like, it won't just be a night it won't be an afternoon in some rich lady's house after he's caught mice. It will be devastating. It'll be raw for him.
Right.
That said, they get home, and he sends her to bed. He's very noble, and he goes down into the servants' quarters. And then she comes to him.
Yeah, she comes to him.
And she's like, I want this. I want you. I want this. It doesn't matter that the butler is 2 doors down. Like, I want this.
My favorite, like, then the butler, like, wakes up the next morning, figures out what's going on, and he and the cook are just like, I can't deal with this. I gotta go. We cede the house to you two.
I mean, it's amazing. That line, I also highlighted that line. It was just a great moment where it was like, because these two are so hot for each other, you guys. They are fucking all over the house. Like, they cannot keep their hands off each other. And this is like possibly the rawest. In historical, this is rare, right? This sort of, well, first of all, you're rarely alone, right? In a house. So leaving her alone in that house with him, like, gives them this freedom to just, I mean, it's like a bacchanal. Like, they're just everywhere.
Right. Well, because they also know right. And the ball is coming, at which point, whatever this is between them, everything will be over. It'll be done. And I think that's like the part too, is it that feeling of that, like, this time with them alone is coming to an end, and they both know it. And it's fascinating. I'm just fascinated by the way in which it plays out, right? Like, by the way in which Winnie sort of, without, again, like, kind of really knowing exactly what she's getting herself into, right? And really decides, like, and going down to him is, again, so important and so different than the way he's been treated by rich women in the past, right? Who he goes up to their rooms and, like, services them, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's just, like, a really fascinating scene. And then, like, the day that the Lamont brothers are going to come back and, like, bring the invitation. And at this point, they talk about what they think might be going on. Right? But I mean, they both realize that these two brothers must be up to something.
Prior to this, I can't remember the timeline, but at some point, the Lamont brothers come and check in. And they bring him some clothes and a hat that he really likes and, like, some other stuff, right? And they leave him 50 pounds in crisp, clean pound notes on the mantelpiece. And they're like, this is for, like, whatever else you need. Like, just, this is for spending. And Mick has a friend named Retso, who we never meet, but who is, like, very important. Or I guess we do meet him, but, like, he's important because he does a lot of things in the background. And Retso is a forger. And, like, that's how Retso gets by. Like, he forges money. And Mick goes and he picks up the money that the twins have left, that the men have left. And he's like, oh, this is really good. Like, this is better than Retso's.
Yes.
And Edwina's like, how could you dare consider that this seems strange. That these are not forged documents. Like, these are up and up gentlemen. And he's like, I guess. And then he kind of leaves it, but it's very clear to him that Mick is on to something. And he can't figure out what the game is. And we don't know what the game is. And Edwina surely doesn't. But she trusts him enough that she sends a letter to the Duke's young wife.
This isn't the Duke's wife that she sends the letter to. I almost said emails. It's one of her students.
You're right.
Right? It's like she's emailing. She's emailing everybody.
Emailing. It's
essentially
1890.
like the people that she has helped kind of get into society. Right. And she has sent a couple letters around like, does anybody know these guys? I'm just checking up on something. And it's one of these women who's like, I don't know, but there is the rumor of these two twin brothers from Bath.
I don't know, somewhere.
Wherever, right? Who potentially are up to no good. Nobody really quite knows, right?
Like, and had passed themselves off as being titled. Like, anyway, doesn't matter. The point is, like, suddenly something starts to smell funny. And then also, before we get into the end of the book, I want to just point out that this is also the time, like right before that day, like during the sex fest that they're having. This is when Mick reveals that he has a plan, and the plan is for him to, because he buys Winnie her dress. So a dress arrives. So, okay, Winnie always gets invited to this ball because she's related to the Duke, and his lovely young wife invites her every year because it's polite. She never goes. But so she has an invitation to this ball, and she's basically waffling. Like, she doesn't think she wants to go, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, it would be really important to me for you to go. And she's like, well, I don't have a dress. Like, I can't afford a like new ball gown. That's beyond my budget. And so he buys her a dress arrives, and it's like the most beautiful dress anybody's ever seen. And she's like, Mick, how? And he's like, and then she's like, where's your dog? Like, Magic, his pet, was there. And now Magic is gone. And he's like, well, I sold all my ferrets and I sold the dogs because I'm not going back.
I have highlighted, a poor man learns what he values more than a rich man. I loved that dog, but I love you more. And I want a life with hot baths and books and enough money for the last of my brothers and sisters to get a good start. So I sold it all, and he bought her a dress. But it's also like, I'm going to become a valet. You could sell this house, and we could
propose it.
Yeah, we could go to the country and be a couple. We could be together.
You could write your papers and publish them and live in the valet's house, and I could be the valet. And then this house, the estate that we're going to has dogs. Like, it will be a different life, but it will be a better one, and we will be together. And he proposes, and she's like, Yeah,
and I think he's not. It's fascinating. It's not like a big betrayal that she doesn't say like yes right away. Like, he understands that he is really presenting her with something that
a completely new life. So then in come the brothers, but they're late. So we cut to their point of view, and they are at the Duke's house the morning of the event, the ball. And they come in, and this is where I think probably, if you were going to have issue with this book, this is where it is.
And this is like, by the way, Rudy, this is like literally 85%. Like,
it's the end of the book.
It's literally the end of the book. Like, everything's going to happen that's going to happen. And we have been teed up for there being some kind of shenanigans with these brothers.
We don't know what the thing is, right? So then they go in, they meet with the Duke, and it is revealed that 30 some odd years ago, a child was stolen. The Duke's grandson was kidnapped, and never found again. And at the time, the Duke, who was very wealthy but not a Duke then, offered £100,000, which is, an astronomical sum of money for any information leading to the discovery of this kidnapped child. And nothing ever came through. And here are these twins, and they go and they find him, and they say, we think we found your grandson. and we're going to prove it. We're going to bring him to the ball tonight to meet you. And there's a portrait on the wall, and one of them says to the other, like, oh my God, it's the spitting image of Tremore, right? And the Duke is like, get the fuck out. Like, you're charlatans. Like, you think I haven't gone 95 years without hearing for the last 30 years from a bunch of people who are just cruel,
scammers like
right?
you, right?
He's like, get out. But ultimately, like, is swayed enough that he gives them an invitation. It's a little bit waved over. But so they get the invitation. They are late to meeting Mick and Edwina, and it's sort of lovely that they're late because in the time that has passed since they were supposed to arrive with evening clothes for Mick, etc., Edwina and Mick have sort of come to this place where maybe it's okay that they never go to this ball. Like maybe there's this future that they didn't plan for. Like this game is no longer of interest to them. But they come anyway. They have the invitation. They go to the ball. There's the ferret's in his pocket. There's a lot that goes on at this ball. It's not really like it's lovely, but we don't need to get into it here. And then, I should also add, so Mick has chosen his clothes. He's chosen a cloak with a purple lining.
Yes, right.
And so they come in, the twins come in, and they're like, okay, well, you love the color purple because they've met with a servant at this house who gave them some information about this child before it was gone. It was kidnapped. This child's favorite color was purple. And Mick was like, well, I do like the color purple. Like, I chose this purple lining. And then the child also loved trains. And Mick was like, I don't know anything about trains. Like, I've never even been on a train. But what I do know is that in America, the red car is called the caboose. And they're like, wait, you know that word? Like, and they're like, why do you know that word? He can't remember. He read it somewhere. He's not sure. And suddenly there is this sense among everyone that, like, well, not Edwina and Mick, because they still don't know quite what's going on. But, like, you get the sense that these twins are suddenly like, oh, shit, like, what if we've actually done this?
One of them's like, what if it's really him? And the other one's like, don't be a fucking idiot. You know what I mean? Like, it's just really funny. But I think the other thing is, this is then the moment. Then they leave, they come back, whatever. And this is when Mick and Edwina kind of talk, like, what? It's weird, the things they were asking. And they kind of put together...
There was a missing child.
A child, right? Like, she's like, wait, there was a missing child. And he's like, this is about a child. And they're like...
It is a bit like, there is a sort of slight moment on the read of this book where you're like, wait, this is really an 85% moment. Like, it's not mentioned at all in the first, Not even any way. Whisper of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and I think that's the part where... it doesn't feel super well integrated into the rest of the plot. It just doesn't. It just feels like, right.
But at this point, you're just like, here we go. We're in a historical. Everything's
We're
crazy.
in a historical.
I love it.
Bippity boppity boo.
Mick is a king. Why not a duke? Why not a duke?
Right. Well, I think the other thing about this that was interesting to me was just like how little they were interested in what the plot could be that they're right. They just, I guess more than anything else, the part that's interesting to me is she's like, let's just not go. And he's like, that's not going to be an option. These men have spent their money. Like there's a way in which he and I think this is like a class issue. I think the way that plays out is he is like, this has to happen now because rich people want it to happen. And we can't escape this trap.
Also, but don't forget, he's also being really noble in this moment because he's like, I'm going to go and I'm going to tell this Duke that these people are trying to fleece him. Like, he has a plan that is very noble. And so they get there and it sort of rolls out the way that it's, expected. Except Mick goes downstairs and speaks to a servant, and then he gets more information that feels like, wait a second, maybe it is me.
Yeah.
And then he goes and he meets the Duke, and they have this moment where the Duke is like, fuck all of you.
Yeah, right. Like, he thinks that they're
in on it.
Yeah.
he's like, how dare you? He calls Edwina terrible things. He like, you know, he gets them out. He like pushes them out of his home. And they go home to Edwina's home. And then like the next morning, they receive news that the Duke, because the ferret.
Yeah.
Mick's ferret has also gotten lost, like in this house, this big house.
Well, because Edwina realizes that it was in his pocket. At some point, she puts two and two together, and she's like, if they figure out that he has a ferret in his pocket, he will be outed as a rat catcher in the most horrible, humiliating way possible. I need to save him from this.
That whole bit, because she's like, no gentleman would ever bring a ferret to a ball. And he's like, how the fuck do you know? Like, all these people are so weird. And then, like, within pages, some other guy's like, oh, I'll help you find it because I lost my monkey once and whatever. Like,
right,
it is hilarious. It's so great. And so and then they get word that the Duke is dying. So they go and they've been summoned back to the house. So they go to the house. They go to his London home. He's been moved to his London home. And they walk in and Mick says, I've ratted this house. I know this house. Except he doesn't know this house. He's never ratted this house. He knows it because he grew up inside this house. Or grew up. He had 3 years inside this house. This is the house of his childhood, or his very early childhood. They go up, the Duke and the ferret are dying in bed, and they realize in that moment that, like, in fact, he is the heir to the dukedom.
Right.
And in fact, this will be what ends up happening. Like, he will inherit this dukedom. And, you know, noble young Mick, like lionheartedly virile Mick, gets king of London, gets to be the wealthy Duke.
Yeah. And I will say this, to me, 25 years later, is like not the way the ending would play out.
Mm-mm. No, the ending now would be they end up like in the country, living the life that they planned together. But I gotta say, okay, so here's where can I just give a little love to like the historical romance? Is like, there's something really lovely and historical about this, though, right? Like the magic, the like fantasy of, and now everyone's a Duke. Like,
sure.
There's something kind of fucking great about that.
It's like a literal fairy tale. Like, right, a literal fairy tale is the princess and the pea, and
lost,
right, like
lost princess.
Lost baby, lost. I mean, so in that way, but it did just feel like the need to wrap it up with, because I think one of the tension, right, I think for the reader now is what the book is saying. And I don't think this is what the book is saying, but I could see this being a question. Is what the book is saying is the reason Mick was able to like pass all these tests and do all these things is because there is some sort of like innate aristocratic, like, right, like way in which like he was able to do all those things because he was the Duke, versus, right, like he's a good guy and he's like smart and capable and funny and all these things, and therefore the dukedom finds him, like, right, like there's this sort of tension there. And I just found myself thinking, if this was written today, this wouldn't have to be the way it ends.
No.
Right, like, oh, magically, by the way, this baby was stolen and it was you.
But also, I don't hate it. I mean, like, I just don't hate it.
Of course not.
Because I feel like, you know, if there is a genre where it can work out this way, it is historical, right? I think what's happening here in 1999, right, in like on the heels of Lisa Kleypas and Beverly Jenkins and Susan Elizabeth Phillips and others who were writing these kind of like real men, right, is we are getting into a movement in historical where the question is like, are you noble or do you have nobility?
Correct.
Right? And that's what Mick is about. Like, he is, and this is an inspiration. This becomes an inspiration for me, for Sherry, for Courtney Milan, for, in many ways, Tessa Dare, right? Like, where we start to sort of see this balance come to pass.
Yeah. No, and I think that that's the part that's like really interesting, right? Is that like, again, like there's nothing more fairy tale than, there's nothing more fairy tale at all than we're going to find each other and be perfect for each other and then be rewarded with the dukedom.
We are
right?
decent, good people, and then we get
and then we'll win
millions of pounds.
Right. Right. And then we'll win. And I think the other thing is in this kind of book now, right? Like a good example would be Louisa Darling's Don't Let Your Dukes Grow Up to Be Scoundrels, right? Her mother is a nanny or like a governess. The Duke had fallen in love with her after his first wife died. He marries the governess, and no one accepts them, and they're all allowed to give them the cut direct. And then after the Duke dies, all of society feels completely enabled and emboldened to turn their back on her. Her entry into that world was never real. It was always conditional. And I think in this book, what we see is Mick instead is there's no way in which the book grapples with how will the rest of the dukes, right? Except the Ratcatcher Duke. It's just going to be fine because he's going to be a duke. And I think that that's part of the way in which it just felt a little different, right? And again, I don't have a problem with it. I just feel like it was very much as I was reading it, I was just
it feels of a time.
Right. Yeah, right.
And I think that's the value of it, right? Historical, as you said from the beginning, it is the best representation of the time in which we are living.
Right. And the time it was written. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a really beautiful book because it, for me, feels like a book that other writers were reading. I feel like this is a book other writers read at this time. Right.
Like I said, I was like, oh, Sherry Thomas and the Dormouse in the Pocket.
It's a pivot book.
Is saying something about Mick.
There's a reason why I love a hot makeout in a East End
alley, right?
Alleyway. Yeah. There are things in this book that we can see.
Yeah.
For every moment that every time people talk about the place in Hell's Bells, there is something
that's talking about this bar, right?
And I mean, I wouldn't have been able to necessarily say that to you 3 years ago, but on the reread, I was like, oh, look, here's this in mine. And I think the dog, the pets, Elizabeth Hoyt is in conversation with this book. And so I think as few historical readers, I mean, I do think a lot of historical readers read this book, but I think way fewer have read this book than have read others. But I do think a lot of writers read this book. And so it's an interesting hinge point. Right? It takes Derek Craven and flips him to a different kind of hero.
Well, and I think that's the part. We had that same conversation when we read Gentle Rogue, right? Where we were like, oh, we can see the ways in which this spawned, right? And then you're going back to the original, its original point.
The original text.
Yeah. And I felt that's how I felt reading this. I was like, I'm reading some kind of uber romance text where I saw all the fingerprints all along. And now I'm going back and being like, oh, here's where those came from.
It's you go back to The Flame and the Flower, which I never recommend anyone do unless they're really interested in the history of romance. But Brandon, the muscle flinches in Brandon's cheek 16 times in that book. And it's well, there it is. There's the DNA. And so I think I'll just say when I finished this, I listened to it on audio and read it at the same time. The audio is really interesting because I'm actually really glad that I listened to it on audio because the voice actor does the speaks,
the accents or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Does the accents. And so it's really interesting. But when I got to the end of it, I really had this moment where I was like, I'm really glad we're reading this because I feel like this is a book. I want people to think of this book as being one of the canon. Do you know what I mean? Such as it is. I feel like it is saying, it is representative of something that was happening in 1999. And when you think about it if you think about 1999, right, that's when the first Bridgerton book was written too. Talk about two when we talk about the family tree, these are two books in the same year that are vastly different in terms of what they are doing, right? Like Julia Quinn is about to like break open the Regency. And like over here on this like Lisa Kleypas arm.
Yeah.
You know, Judith Ivory is really talking about class.
It turns out then that Mick's mother was the governess, again, the nanny, right? And she
the wet nurse.
Yeah, she's the one who kidnapped Mick. And
because she hated the family.
Yeah,
she's like, you don't deserve this boy.
You don't deserve this baby.
Well, she's also dead.
Yeah, she's dead.
So we can't go back.
So we can't go back. And I also was really interested in how little the book cared, frankly, about
why
that happened. It almost to the point where it was like a MacGuffin, like, but the MacGuffin was the baby, right? I think that part was also really interesting to me, and I think that and the other thing that's really clear is, so there's like these 14, she's very Catholic. Clearly this woman was earning money to care for the children.
Yeah, she was sex working.
By being a sex worker.
I mean, he says it.
And he says that. He's like, it's kind of ironic.
She was paying for us.
She was paying for us in a way that made more of us.
Yeah.
But I was really fascinated by the way in which the book is not very interested at all in exploring why she might have done that.
No.
Right?
No.
It almost to the point where, like, again, if I was editing this book now, I'd be like, we might need a little bit more here.
Well, I think we would have had it if it had been pulled. It's almost like it went in on a later draft and didn't get pulled through to the beginning.
Sometimes I say that to people. I'm like, you need to pull this back. Like, we need to see the breadcrumbs of this way earlier. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but one conversation here, one piece of, information here. And I think that's why I think in some ways, and like you said, I think if someone was going to say, like, look, this part is underdeveloped, you're right, it is.
I don't think it falls apart, but I can see why that would be a concern.
Yeah.
That said, Mick Tremore for president, and
I had a great time reading this book.
Listen, and every time I say, have you ever read the one with the rat catcher? Some historical reader wrinkles their nose and is like, rat catcher. And I'm like, trust me, I would not steer you wrong.
There's a part on page where he realizes there's rats in her carriage house. And he's like, they're going to come into the house eventually. Like, I could see that over there. And she's like, no one else would ever notice that. He's like, you're telling me that a man sitting here wouldn't notice a fucking hole in the floor or whatever. And he then, like, this part is fascinating, like, sets up a scenario where they're going to have to go catch the rats in her carriage house. And he has her come and watch.
This, like, brutal.
Because he realizes, but, like, also impressive. Right? Like, he's like, you just think it's gross, but watch me do my work. Right? It was fascinating.
Listen, if my husband were a rat catcher, I would think that was terrific. Because I live in New York City where everyone has a mouse.
Everyone has a mouse. It's funny because my TFA roommate, Mindy, maybe I've told this story, there were rats in her building. Sorry, I'm going to wrap it up. And then a rat catcher, literally like a modern day rat catcher exterminator, came into her room, like walked into the room and was like, you've got rats. And I was like,
you have told this story. No, disgusting. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't.
So
I want to die. Anyway. Mick Tremore. Lionhearted virility for the win. And he shaves off his mustache, so it makes both be happy
Everybody's
because of the beginning and Jen happy because of the end. So it works out great. Anyway, everybody, welcome to 2025. I'm Sarah McLean. I'm here with my friend Jen Prokop. We are Fated Mates. You can listen to us every Wednesday. We are here in 2025 for you every Wednesday, we promise. And you can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Blue Sky, on Threads, or on Instagram, where we are Fated Mates or Fated Mates Pod. And you can also, if you really love hanging out with us, come hang out with us on the Discord, which you get access to when you join our Patreon. More information on that is in show notes and at fatedmates.net/Patreon. Speaking of show notes, Jen puts them together every week. They are filled with lots of the things that we talk about on the podcast. Go check them out because they're amazing. And you can always find us at fatedmates.net. Thanks so much, everybody. We're going to get through it. Happy 2020.
Catching rats in 2025.
A girl can dream.